Indian philosophy is strategic autonomy.
Historically, India also has a long-standing relationship with Russia.
India has two hostile powers on its borders. So it's not a happy neighborhood.
Global Eyes, a new take on security policy by DW.
Here in Europe, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is certainly still dominating the headlines, from the war on the ground to how it's affecting the world order, even to the threat of nuclear war.
And the knock-on effect that's hitting us the hardest is the energy crisis, right?
Exactly. So you had all of these European countries rolling back their flow of energy from Russia that they were so dependent on for such a long time as part of the Western sanctions against Russia, and really in a bid to try and starve Russia or starve the Kremlin of the resources that it needs to try and keep this war going, which has only really had a limited effect so far.
But if you look at the global south, the picture is quite different. I mean, if you look at the large countries there, China, India, South Africa, these are the countries that have actually refused to condemn the war. And in fact, this is the invasion because of which tens of thousands of people have lost their lives. There's so many cities there that are completely destroyed. And yet, we have India, on the other hand, that is buying more oil from Russia, and that too on discounted rates.
So would it be fair to say that India is, in a roundabout way, profiting from the war in Ukraine because it's been able to buy this Russian oil at cheaper prices right now?
Or if I could just put it in different words, is the war here in Europe making the chapati in India cheaper?
Well, that's the question that we want to try and answer in the coming 30 minutes or so. I'm Kate Brady.
I'm Isha Bhatia.
And we give you a very warm welcome to the very first episode of DW's new podcast, Global Eyes. On this podcast, we'll be taking security policy out of the realms of academia, think tanks, and government buildings and breaking it down to find out exactly what it means for you.
You know what, Kate? I picked up my cup of cappuccino this morning and it costed me what? €4.
€4?
Exactly. The prices here, they are skyrocketing, and we are experiencing this inflation at what? Above 10%.
10%, yeah.
And everyone's worried that they're going to freeze this winter. And at the heart of it all is energy, or maybe the lack of it.
Lack thereof. Yeah, which is interesting because when you look at somewhere like India right now, when it comes to inflation and the energy crisis, they at least seem to be faring somewhat better right now.
Yeah, a lot of people seem to think like that.
Well, yeah, because you have this chunk of energy that that Europe used to be buying from Russia is no longer importing, and a lot of that is now ending up in India. Russia's been looking around for new customers, and India's buying this oil now at cheaper prices from Russia.
That's right. And if we look at the stats, the Indian economy is actually growing. I mean, it hasn't seen a boom. I wouldn't put it like that. But slow and steady. It's certainly going up. And then again, things are not as easy, as straightforward as a lot of people would think like they are. I mean, overall, the prices of oil, they have risen. So it's quite a strange situation where you say the economy is rising, but the prices of oil, they're also rising. And there you have the Indian foreign minister saying that oil is actually breaking India's back. And so whatever good deals we get, we're just going to get them. And hence, India's buying a lot of oil from Russia.
Exactly. Well, I think that sounds like a good time to maybe bring in our first guest and jump straight in with some big geopolitical questions. She's going to be our first of two guests today to help us get to the bottom of all of this.
Exactly. So let's have Seema Sirohi. She's a renowned expert on India's foreign relations. Seema is based in Washington, and she's a researcher for daily-based think tank, the Observer Research Foundation. She's a columnist for the Economic Times. Seema, we are very happy to have you with us. Welcome to Global Eyes. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, and glad to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Seema, I'm going to jump straight in with some of the big geopolitical questions here. Looking back, in general, I think it's fair to say when it comes to foreign policy, India has always tried to keep a distance in a way from some of the big powers. But now that it's become this, even larger customer when it comes to buying energy right now, particularly from Russia, I wonder, is India moving closer to Russia at a time when a lot of countries, especially Western countries, are trying to distance themselves from Russia?
No, not at all. I would dispute that because if you remember, the Prime Minister of India said quite openly in full public view that this is not an era for war. India, if anything, is keeping sort of equidistant from all the poles in the world right now, because Indian philosophy is strategic autonomy. It doesn't want to be in either camp. And that's what's happening. Remember that India has a very long standing relationship with Russia in terms of, going back all the way to the 50s when Russia used its veto power in favor of India in the UN Security Council on the Kashmir issue. Then India has a very strong defense relationship with Russia. 60 to 70% of the equipment that India uses comes from Russia. This, again, is a historical fact at a time when the West was unwilling to sell weapons to India. India really had no choice. So there are a lot of factors in play. History doesn't begin today or when European, powers decide that this is important. Countries don't fall in line that way. They have their own national interest.
Thank you. Now, that brings me back to the recent comment of Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, that he put it very bluntly that Russia has actually helped India when India needed it, and America was supporting Pakistan at that time. So I've been following a lot of social media trends, and I see that there is a lot of support with Indian people for Russia. But other than that, I mean, other than this sentiment, when it comes to Kashmir, when it comes to India, Pakistan, Indians are always very emotional about this whole thing. But other than that, do you see there's anything deeper, or is it just on this level?
That's pretty deep, if you ask me. If I'm the prime minister of a country of 1 billion people, then that's pretty deep reason. Then, as I explained earlier, the defense relationship. Um, India has two hostile powers on its borders, East and West, China and Pakistan. And China and Pakistan are in collusion. They have a very strong relationship, strong security relationship. Pakistan gained nuclear weapon designs from China and became a really serious threat to India. And as you know, India and Pakistan have fought wars. India and China had a war in 1962. So it's not a happy neighborhood. I think that's what Europeans forget and kind of don't understand that currently, as we speak, thousands, hundreds of thousands of Indian forces are in a standoff with Chinese forces on the border. So in 2020, China made several incursions into India, and 20 Indian soldiers were brutally killed by Chinese forces. So, I mean, this is India's reality. And as I explained, India cannot afford at this time, when it faces such a terrible border situation with China, cannot afford to alienate Russia. Then there is an extra reason. It also doesn't want Russia to go completely into the Chinese camp. This the Westerners understand to some extent because they also don't want Russia and China to be completely aligned. Because, at least for the United States, I live in Washington, so I mean, I follow all this closely. For the US, China is a strategic competitor, and they want to have partnerships with different Asian countries, including India. India is a bulwark of US policy in the Indo-Pacific currently. So there are many reasons, and all of them quite important and significant, I would say.
Of course, none of us can see into the future, but I wonder, just looking forward, what do you see India's role developing into going forward? We've just had the G20 summit just in the last couple of weeks as well. The presidency is now of the G20 has been passed on to India. But even though India was present at the G20 summit, it seemed like that the country's presence in a way was overshadowed by, not least of all, the meeting between US President Joe Biden and China's Xi Jinping, for example. I wonder, is there room there for India to really build up its role and build up its profile?
Yes, it's a very, very important presidency. And if you followed the negotiations for the joint leaders' declaration after the G20 summit, Indian diplomacy was, recognized for getting a consensus document through. And there's qualified criticism of the Russian invasion and Russian war against Ukraine. So that if you see the nuances in what's happening, India is making it very clear in the best way possible to Russia that it's time to end the war so that uh, the countries that are suffering the most are the developing countries. Food prices, fertilizer prices, energy prices, they've all gone up. Nobody is benefiting. So it's not just Europe that, has this is suffering, that the whole world is suffering. And India has been engaged in a sort of backdoor diplomacy with President Putin, and the Indian Prime Minister has talked to President Zelensky as well early in October. So I think the G20 summit that just concluded wanted to show to the Western world mainly that for developing countries, this is a very important grouping, very important. And Indonesia, which was the past president, India, which is the current president, and Brazil, the future president of G20, all came together to bring out this document because they didn't want the summit to be dubbed a failure where there was no consensus document coming
Right,
out. So I
right.
would say a
Uh,
lot of things happened. Yeah.
Yeah, I just came back from the G20 and I saw India trying to have this balancing act between the East and the West. And you've been talking about this document, and India has really played a crucial role in wording that document so that nobody gets offended and everyone is at one platform. You are in the States. How do you see the US administration? How does the US administration view all of this?
There has been praise for Indian diplomacy from the White House spokesperson. Yesterday, there was a big event at the Indian ambassador's house, and the Deputy National Security Advisor was present. He also praised, whatever happened at the G20. Uh, in Washington, what I'm noticing is that even the Americans want the war to end. They don't want to force Zelensky's hand, but they've been gently, sort of nudging him towards some sort of negotiation or some sort of diplomacy that leads to ending this war.
So you just mentioned that there's been a lot of praise for India. So if I just want to understand this clearly, is there no criticism about India in US right now, that India is close to Russia? I mean, we are sitting here in Europe and we see this constant critique that why is India not condemning Russia? Do you see that kind of sentiment in US, or is there absolute no discussion over that?
No, there's a lot of discussion. In when the war started, there was a lot of criticism of India because India took a neutral position, and it abstained on various UN resolutions. There was a lot of criticism, but then Indian diplomats, led by the foreign minister, did some major explaining, And the US official stance, at least, has become much more nuanced. They have said in every statement they've made over the past 3 months is that they understand that India's relationship with Russia is historic. India's dependence for defense needs goes back a long way. India is transitioning. All these things have been mentioned. So, yes, there's criticism in the mainstream media, which is what most people read. Uh, but if you read the Indian media, you will see many of these stories that I'm talking about. They don't get covered in the kind of detail that gives you the full picture, I would say.
Right. So, if I may just bring you back to our core question that we've been discussing here, we've talked about India, China, Russia, US, and these are all very complicated issues when it comes down to the common man. So, when it really boils down to the common man and their needs, does this whole conflict really have any effect on the common man in India or on the common man's pocket, for instance?
Absolutely. The price of oil, the price of gas, the price of food, fertilizers, the farmers are hurting. So, everything has an effect on the common man. And it's the Indian government's responsibility to provide energy, right? So, for the economy not to tank. If you see India's neighborhood, you saw what happened in Sri Lanka. There are fears that similar things might happen in Bangladesh. Protests on the streets, governments in danger, riots on the street because people don't have, gas in their fuel tanks. So, yes, it's a very real thing. Um, Same thing is happening in Africa. So the developing world is actually hurting much, much more than people recognize. And that's I think, also part of Indian diplomacy to give a voice to the global South, to give, articulation to what's going on in the world that normally doesn't get that much attention.
In your opinion, is there enough attention given by the general population in India towards what's going on internationally, in terms of, how, so that people can better understand the impact of foreign policy and security policy?
You mean whether the Indian people understand that China is a great threat to their security? Yes, they do understand. If you look at surveys, earlier in the Indian people were more concerned with Pakistan, but increasingly they cite China as the major threat because of what happened in 2020 on the border. Um, and that standoff continues. It's 2 years that it's going on, and 16 rounds of talks have taken place with with very little progress. So yes, people understand what's going on in terms of foreign policy, and the Ukraine war is a very real thing because it hurts them sort of directly.
But trade with China that still continues despite the conflict, right?
Yes, and that's a very good point. And in fact, the trade is rising because decoupling, as I think people in the West know as well, decoupling from China is going to be very tough, very long, if at all. It happens because China is the world's factory. It has had 20 years to become that. Every major economy in the world is dependent on China. Supply chains, many of them are centered in China. So, but there's a move away from that. It'll take a while. It's not happening tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Seema. That was really, really insightful. Thanks for putting things in perspective and for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kate, what I found really interesting was that Seema made a mention to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's quote that this is not an era of war. And this was actually something that he had said in the SEO summit, and that was later picked up for the G20 final document. And there you see that, again, India is underlying its non-aligned stance that it does not want to be in any camps, whether Russia or US or any other camp, let's say. But as she has put things in perspective for us, that India cannot afford to lose Russia. And there's these historical ties, and so India will continue to buy oil from Russia, and it's
Absolutely.
important.
Yeah, and I think this is that the sense of this balancing act. And she said that India's trying to keep itself kind of equidistant from the East and West right now, which has its long history. But I think that is going to be really interesting to watch how that develops in the coming years as well, especially with the situation with China. And I think what makes the position really unique with India, as Seema was telling us, is how so many of India's domestic issues for the rest of the world could very much become huge foreign policy and security policy issues as well. So certainly this balancing act really certainly is going to get more complicated, I feel.
That's right. And talking of domestic issues, as you said, what I'm really interested in finding out is that how does all of this really affect the common man? I mean, coming back to our core question, whether it's going to make food prices cheaper, whether it's going to make the chapati cheaper. And to understand that, let's have our second guest. That's Nandikesh Sivalingam. He is the director of Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. That's a think tank that's based in Helsinki. And Nandikesh has been working on coal and power related issues in India for over a decade, and he has loads of expertise in policies and politics around energy sector in India. Nandikesh, you're joining us from Bangalore today. Thank you so much for your time. Welcome to Globalize.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So everyone's talking about the war in Ukraine and whether India is taking advantage of the situation there. And that's also what we would like to talk to you about today.
Exactly, and a lot of people are asking as well whether it's really morally correct to continue trade with Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, or in the case of India, for example, expanding trade with Russia. So before we get into the details of that, maybe you can just give us pinpoint a few basic facts for us. Where did India get its energy supply from before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and what has changed since the war?
So to put it in perspective, India still gets its majority of its oil supplies from non-Russian sources, right? If you look at volumes that comes to India through Russia is a minuscule amount, 2.4%. Even the latest, it was 1.7% before last year. So therefore, that's the perspective that needs to be first in terms of when you look at what is India is actually up to with Russian oil buying.
What would you say is the main incentive for India to really step up as this huge energy customer right now? We hear a lot about these discounts. Obviously, Russia has been looking around, shopping around for new customers as well. What's the real incentive behind that? Is it just the case that there are discounted prices and India's making the most of that while it can?
So the need to go for Russian oil came from the fact that when the war started, the prices of oil shot up drastically, right? India being a energy challenged country where we don't produce most of our oil, it's all imported. That pinched India's pocket. So the need to go for Russian discounted oil was kind of out of necessity to keep inflation in check and to consider price rises for Indian citizens. So the underlying factor is it is a challenge morally to the entire world in terms of how do we deal with the crisis. But almost all the countries went about or still going about deciding what to do with Russian fossil fuels based on its practical issues that it's facing domestically with respect to prices, with respect to availability and things like that. So India also took a similar route in terms of trying to manage its domestic cost to keep costs down. Therefore, it had to, it had no other choices, what I would say in this case.
Yeah. And I just wonder, I mean, the headlines here for, almost a year now, of course, have been filled every day with the latest headlines from Ukraine. You're in India right now. I wonder, what are the main concerns there? Is anyone concerned really about the war in Ukraine? Is that still a big issue?
So within people's mind, it's any war is concerning, right? People lives lost is for wasteful reasons. is always a concern. But if you look at in terms of the day-to-day discourse in the country, whether Ukraine is the main topic, definitely not. I think India has a lot of issues with respect to domestically as well as in the neighborhood where India is trying to sort out many challenges. Therefore, it's not the top agenda, but definitely it's a concern that Indians as well as the government has.
Then let's actually talk about the things that really matter to India. Like you said, it's not a discourse in India. And what really matters to the common man, the Aam Aadmi, as we say in India, is, Kate, if I may just say 3 words in Hindi, it's roti, kapra, makan. That's what we say. Roti is chapati, basically food. Kapra is cloth, and makan is where you live. So you've talked about inflation. You've said that it's come out of necessity that India has to buy things, has to buy fuel, oil, because it has to keep inflation in check. So directly talking, how is this buying of oil from Russia, how is it directly affecting the common man there?
See, like if you look at historically, if you look at last couple of years, India's prices of like oil specifically has gone up, right, including gas as well. So, like the volume of whatever oil that India is buying from Russia is used to because the price discounts and other things. It's used to keep uh, runaway prices of fossil fuels at check to some extent. But that doesn't mean that India's prices has not gone up this year. It's shot up to almost from $1 a liter to now $1.3 a liter. So it has still pinched India.
Right. Thank you for putting it in perspective. So basically, what you're saying is that India or people in India are not really profiting out of the trade from Russia, or the way it has been put that this is sanction and yet India is continuing trade. So India does not continue to profit out of Russia in that way.
See, it's again. I'll go back to the inflation argument, right? So Indian government has to take certain measures with respect to keeping inflation at at a minimal level. It's around 6-7%, right? So they think using some part of it through buying discounted oil from Russia would give some relaxation in terms of having that check. So that's definitely one aspect in terms of why it India is doing purchasing of Russia at necessity basis. But historically, India also has a long-standing relationship with Russia, where they cannot and will not take decisions drastically as other countries may or may not take. Therefore, that so the current necessities of inflation and the energy security for the country, coupled with what historically India has been having as a relationship with Russia, defense, and many other things, would be two primary criteria how the government would look at what steps they should be taking.
So we've touched briefly on inflation now. I'm just wondering if we can shift maybe to energy. You talked a little bit already about energy security. India, of course, now as well, major force in the global energy economy as well. And of course, the demand has been growing symbiotically as the population grows as well. And I imagine that that's only going to increase in the coming years as well. But I wonder the way in which India is now deciding to buy more or invest more in Russian fossil fuels, does that not risk making India more dependent on Russia for its energy? Something that Europe, for example, has experienced firsthand and really felt the bite of, now that they've had to wind down their flow of Russian energy since the war in Ukraine.
So two aspects, right? One is Russia was not conventionally an exporter to India. Again, I said like what it was 1.7 before the war. It's gone to 3% plus or minus. Right? So that's a small volume for India to be dependent on Russia, assuming that that's it remains at that level. So the volumes are too small to say that there would be a dependency created. Right? But on the other hand, it's only a small volume on oil. Unlike so, India does not have much dependency on gas. India definitely has enough coal reserves for its electricity demand. So therefore, it would never be in a situation where Europe is, where the dependencies are much greater. Right? So therefore, I don't see that as an issue where India becoming dependent on Russian fossil fuels. On the other hand, India also is investing heavily on renewable energy sources. So that's going to be one of the key primary driving factors with respect to the electricity market in the next decade or so, where India would look at diversifying even from coal and other sources, so that there's no dependency on one particular source. So I think that's the message globally that that we try to communicate. that putting all eggs in the fossil fuel bucket has led to this situation, then there's definitely a need to diversify and then look at our sources as well, mainly clean ones.
But since you're talking about renewables here, I mean, even if we were to keep Russia and Saudi Arabia aside, is it possible for India to get completely independent in the next decade or couple of decades, let's say, when it comes to energy?
So, with respect to electricity, where the dependency is on coal, domestic coal, and to some level of imported coal, in it by 2040 is definitely possible because the renewable energy markets are well advanced. Therefore, I don't see why that's not cannot be achieved. Whereas India needs to progress is on oil, where the alternatives are now emerging with respect to electric vehicles, improving public transport, and things like that. I think there's a lot of work to be happening. So I don't see like there needs to be a lot of work put in to move away from oil specifically. But I think India is in a reasonably good enough track. I think this crisis, if at all it has done, the silver lining of that is it's accelerating the clean energy transition across the world mainly. I think India would also see it as in that light, and then push for better policies to keep its energy secure.
And what about nuclear energy? The argument is that it is, of course, cleaner as compared to coal.
It's definitely cleaner than coal. I think different countries have different viewpoints on nuclear energy, right? For India, it has been the main concern has been safety, right? And still, at least in my opinion, we have not cracked the safety discussion because of the population density and where these nuclear power plants are located. So those are, and it takes sheer like decades to build nuclear power, and it's also more expensive than renewable energy. So if all these things are stacked against nuclear, I don't see that growing in a bigger way.
So to wrap it up, you've been talking about inflation. Uh, I found it very interesting that you said that what India is buying from Russia is actually just a very small chunk, and that will not really make much of a difference. But at the same time, you also said that India needs to keep buying from Russia to keep inflation in check. So these are like two things for me that don't really come together so well. If you could just put that together, like how do these two things really relate to each other? And coming back to our core question, if that's going to keep inflation in check, our question was whether it's going to affect the price of chapati. I know when we talk about inflation in India, we don't really talk about chapati as such. It's about the cooking gas cylinders or the onions. But symbolically speaking, is it going to really make difference to the common people? If you could just
So
wrap it up.
sure. So this is how it is, right? So instead of buying your 100% of your oil from an already higher price market, right? Where you buy say 95% of it and this 5% you substitute through discounted oil, which is 25 to 35% substituted. That would mean that your overall cost is still less than what you would otherwise would have paid, right? Now the question is whether that would make a significant dent on inflation itself. To some extent, yes, but to a large extent, not, because inflation is not only a price of fossil fuel issue; it has a lot of other parameters which the government needs to check.
Thank you, Nandikesh. That was very insightful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
So we've had Russia, we've had India, we've had the US, China, Europe. I think it's fair to say we've covered quite a bit of ground with our two guests today.
Lots to digest, right? So after talking to Seema and Nandikesh, what are your takeaways?
Well, I think one of the main words that stuck out to me from both of them in two very different areas was dependency. So on the one hand, you have these huge domestic issues that India is trying to, deal with right now, not least of all when it comes to the rise of China, but that struggle of trying to reduce its dependency on China, something that Europe is facing as well right now, not least of all Germany, and kind of reassessing its economic ties with China. But also that applies to the energy situation as well. We heard there from Nandikesh about the need to diversify, not only for, in terms of climate protection, but also as to come back to Europe, Europe has learnt the hard way that it became far too dependent on Russia. And so that was interesting to hear that there is, a bit of a risk right now that India could find itself in a similar position if it becomes too dependent on Russia. So I think, you know, we throw this term around quite frequently about you know, the shift of the world order, but it's really these shifts in dependency are really going to keep changing in the coming years, and I think that's going to be a real challenge for India, especially when it comes to this balancing act, this geopolitical balancing act that it's still keeping up at the moment between East and West.
That's right. But you know what I found really interesting was that Nandikesh mentioned that the total amount of import that India has from Russia is still minuscule. And so he's saying that India would still not be as dependent on Russia as others are fearing. And we've actually been talking a lot about whether what India is doing is morally correct or not. Ever since the war broke out, since February, we've continuously been listening to this, that India should stop having trade ties with Russia. And if you look at the numbers, they've actually gone up like anything. It's a rise of 300%, which is huge. But like Nandikesh had put it, if you really look at the absolute numbers, it's still not as much as the EU is doing, or I mean, sitting here in Germany, even the trade that Germany has with Russia. I know we're not going to have Russian gas now, so the winters are going to be difficult. But when it comes to India, India is not going to stop having trade with Russia because, one, it needs it. Two, it's still not as much as the EU. And another thing that I found really interesting was, and I think that's my takeaway, that Seema mentioning China and saying that despite the tensions between India and China, India will continue having trade with China, which I think in the whole geopolitical scenario, that's really interesting. That on the one hand, you have this tension on your border area. On the one hand, you have your people hating the others, and there's this constant discussion of, you know, that we have to boycott China. I mean, I really see this a lot in social media where people are saying, boycott China, don't buy anything that's Chinese, but the government continues to have trade. So the government can't say boycott China because the trade is important, and in fact China's become so important, you can't just say boycott China and then where are you going to get your smartphones from? Well, but that's a completely different area that we can't get into right now on our podcast. And so coming back to our core question.
Yes, the economic impact right now is the war in Ukraine making the chapati cheaper.
Well, it doesn't really look like it. Not in the long run, at least. So that's all we have for you on this episode of Globalize. If you liked it, do subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts and let us know what you think about it.
And if you have any questions for us here at Globalize about how security is or could affect your life, let us know. You can send us an email at globaleyes@dw.com. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.